People usually talk about global poverty in terms of morality. I get it, there are fairness issues here. But solving inequality is not a matter of charity. It's essential to the survival of human civilization. So today, we'll talk about why it's so important and what we can do about it. Let's dig in. Welcome to the Human Survival Podcast, where we aim for world cooperation on critical threats to humanity. To survive, we must see ourselves first as citizens of the human race. To thrive, we must protect what is beautiful about humanity. This show is offered by the Human Survival Project, a grassroots movement for citizens around the world to push for a redesigned and much stronger United Nations. Our global threats need global cooperation. This is urgent, so let's start. Hi friends, welcome to the Human Survival Podcast. I'm Shelby Murtis. Thanks for joining us. So today we are going to talk about global poverty and inequality in the world. This show is part of the Human Survival Project, which pushes for a much stronger United Nations that can help us globally manage our global issues, and especially the big existential threats that could cause intense hardship for humanity. And among those huge threats, we include poverty and inequality. And, these often get talked about in terms of fairness and morality, which is obviously the case. But we approach it also in terms of survival and in terms of even self-interest. Like, we all need to handle this if we're going to have a decent future, because poverty gets in the way of our other problems. So we're not going to solve climate change if poor countries cannot afford solar panels and wind turbines, and they continue burning coal and oil and everything. We can't solve pandemics if poor countries cannot afford vaccines or even basic health care. Poverty is a huge driver of migration, which will intensify as climate change gets worse. So we've got these other kinds of problems that are nearly impossible to solve if we don't manage poverty in the world and address it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And with us is a guest who knows a lot about this. Kim Thelwell is with the Borgen Project. She is their Vice President of Communications and Policy. The Borgen Project works to get the United States government to take global poverty more seriously and invest in solutions to manage this problem. So, Kim, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I've been looking forward to this for a couple of months now, so I'm really glad to be a guest.
So could you start by telling us more about the Borgen Project and what you all do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to just make a little update to your intro as well, which is to say that the Borgen Project now has chapters in the UK as of a year and a half ago. And then as of this month, which is January 2024, we now have a chapter in Canada as well. So we're excited to be taking things even more global in terms of our advocacy work. And related to that work that we're doing is that we are trying to help address injustices that exist in the world, as you're talking about a lot on your podcasts as well, by taking that issue or those issues to the highest possible level, which is lawmakers. So we are really encouraging and motivating people across the country here in the States, and then, as I said, in other places as well, to take action, to learn about the issues that exist that sometimes people don't often think about because it might seem far removed, but recognizing that we're all in this world together and we all exist together, and that we all do well when we all do well, which is kind of one of the taglines of the Borgen Project. So as I said, we form this collective kind of push with our volunteers and supporters who are then helping to share that message with their own personal networks. And then from there, the Borgen Project, we meet with elected officials who have the power to actually make changes, to implement laws and policy that will help those who are most in need. And in so doing, there are also spillover benefits for the countries that are making these investments in foreign aid. So a little bit of a unique model, organizational model, if you will, but hopefully that makes sense in terms of how we are able to organize, influence, and encourage these laws to happen.
Yeah, nice. So, how did you get into all this? What inspired you to
Yes,
join this work
yeah,
and do this? What gets you up every day in the morning
sure.
wanting to like go
Yeah,
hit it?
sure. And I think this work found me. I didn't really find it, if that makes sense. So I had a whole previous life before this in the corporate world, but I always felt kind of a push to do something more. But I just didn't realize that I could have a career in this space. And I've been working at the Borgen Project almost a decade now. So it's been a wonderful, just fulfilling opportunity for me on personal note. And then in terms of how I found the organization, or how I came about being a part of this wonderful group, is that I met Clint Borgen, who's the founder of the Borgen Project. As I said, almost 10 years ago now, and I signed up for just helping out with a small, I think, an admin project at the time, just part time, just helping out. And it turned into this role. And he's been a wonderful mentor, and I've been able to really learn on the job. As I said, I did not have a background in this space. I did the whole traditional, like, MBA. I did all of the typical business type things in my former life, as I said. And then I was able to transition into making this a career. Should also mention that I was born and raised in a developing country. I did not experience poverty personally, but I saw examples of it, right, growing up, um, living in the suburbs. Literally every time you drive to school or anywhere, you have to drive through the poorest pockets just to get back into the suburbs, if you will. So you kind of, it's really sad to say, but you kind of shut the door, once you get home, and you can shut everything else out. So I definitely had that more sheltered upbringing where you just kind of live in your bubble and kind of see examples, but keep moving. One of the reasons, though, you keep moving, and I grew up in Jamaica, is also the crime, which of course is, there is such a significant relationship between crime and poverty, cause and effect, whichever way you want to look at that. And so that was one of the reasons as well. We often just kind of led a more sheltered upbringing, is crime. Like growing up, you wouldn't necessarily walk by yourself, ever, things like that. So I did always have that feeling toward wanting to do more. And as I became older, I did a lot of volunteering there. And then, as I said, it made it that much easier to then start in this more formal role and turn this into a career for myself. So very long-winded answer, but hopefully that gives some background or insight into my thinking anyway.
Yeah, it's cool. Yeah.
Mhm.
So, you and I care about poverty, and your organization does. Not everyone cares about it. Or even if they do, you might stop and get them to think about it and be like, oh, yeah, I care. But a lot of people are just going through their life ignoring this. So, in the countries you focus on, like the UK and Canada and the UK, why should people care about this?
Yeah, and I think Shelby, you mentioned a good point as well, in terms of kind of the moral responsibility, like it's the right thing to do. Um, but then what, right? So yes, people can appreciate that we should be helping um, those who are barely surviving. And just to give an example of um, some, I guess you could call it objections that we might often hear is, Well, there's homelessness in America, for example, or crises in the UK, and that those are correct factual statements. But when we think of experiences in the most vulnerable places across the globe, where people are living in conditions that you and I could not even fathom or conceptualize, it becomes a different conversation, in my view, at least, to be able to help those individuals. That being said, at the Borgen Project, what we explain is that addressing domestic policy issues don't have to conflict with global issues. So we can be able to accomplish both at the same time. One thing that's really interesting also is the amount that it would take to address the inequalities and injustices in these regions that we're talking about, and actually eradicate something like global hunger, which is a big issue in itself. But when we look at, I was thinking recently about some statistics that Oxfam released, which is a group that we sometimes work with. And they released a report on how US billionaires' wealth increased over the past 4 years. So since COVID began, and it was about, I'm trying to remember, so I'm talking slowly, about a $1 trillion increase in the net worth of American billionaires over the past 4 years. $1 trillion. There are less than 800 billionaires in America. So let's just put that into perspective when we think of how much it would actually cost to end hunger globally by 2030. I think it's something like $30 billion a year to end hunger. I hope I'm quoting that correctly, per year over the next several years. And then we think of just a few hundred people who have accumulated or increased their net worth by in just 4 years by $1 trillion. It's really eye-opening to kind of think of things in terms of the inequality scale as well. So these are the types of things that I wouldn't say keep me up at night, but they do make me wake up in the morning thinking, okay, how can we kind of share this message a bit more and get people thinking outside of themselves? So that's one thing I would say is how we really view this topic of why people should help, because it is the right thing to do. But as we're thinking of how can it maybe benefit, when we're thinking of that self-interest portion, because natural human nature is people are also going to gravitate toward how it helps them. That's just the nature of humanity where we are. So one of the things that we look at is how foreign aid helps to protect our national security interests in America, because when people are vulnerable, they're barely surviving. They have no way to get food. They have no shelter. They often become desperate. And in some regions, that means potentially turning toward extremism or terrorist groups to be able just to get those basic things to survive. So if a country like the United States or England is able to provide some aid dollars to address those very basic needs, which should be basic rights, in my view, it can help to then deter those individuals from maybe making those choices. And then it protects our safety as well. It also creates jobs. There are numerous countries that were former recipients of US foreign aid back in the day who are now huge partners in trade. Example, South Korea. And so those kind of case studies, and these are kind of also the messages we share as we're meeting with elected officials who they themselves may not have, a strong background in, foreign policy or foreign relations, is showcasing these very tangible returns on foreign aid, which can then be viewed as investments. So that's been really effective for us in just explaining concepts that might seem so very far removed from day-to-day life that we are living, but how we can be able to connect those dots. And we really drill down and get even more specific in terms of examples and case studies that we've seen where it's really clear, like no question that, okay, wow, so we can help people and help ourselves. Like this is doable. And as I said before, for a very, very small cost relative to other parts of the federal budget. Foreign aid is smallest slice, like 1% of the foreign aid budget, of the federal budget goes toward foreign aid. So it's super small in terms of the investment that's actually made annually. But I'll pause here because I've been talking quite a bit, and I would love to get your thoughts on what I've mentioned so
Yeah, I
far.
appreciate it, and I like how you draw the connection with poverty and military and violence. Because you just noted one of the very small parts of the U.S. budget, foreign aid, and then
Mm-hmm.
one of the very largest parts of the budget is military. And
Yeah.
that money is going to get spent anyway, whether
Mm-hmm.
we're going to be proactive and help these places overcome violence, or I'm sorry, overcome poverty, or you're going to spend it in troops when the next war breaks out and we need to maintain stability somewhere in the world. And so I don't know. It makes sense to just be proactive and spend the money in a good way rather than on the back end as everything's falling apart. That's the worst way to
Mm-hmm.
spend it.
Absolutely. And for every dollar spent in conflict prevention, the US is able to save $16, it's 1/6, on actually military spending. So, it's a no-brainer in our our minds
Right.
at the Borgen Project. But no, I'm glad you pulled that out as a point of reference too.
Yeah. I might mention one other place where we could proactively solve an issue is around migration. Because right now, for instance, the U.S. has this flood of people wanting to migrate into the United States, which, I mean, I welcome them. They can help us build our economy and be good workers. But, there's conflict around that. And it's just, it's starting to create instability throughout Mexico and Central and South America, all these people on the move. And it's just a very unstable situation that is going to cost the U.S. money in facing all this. So instead of spending money on troops at the border or building more walls or all of that, you could spend it on actually helping some of these countries, improve their situation. So,
Absolutely. And, if you think of the reasons that push people to even consider, in many of these cases, making really scary journeys, unsafe journeys with young children. There's a reason why why they're doing that. They're trying to find just safety, basic needs. So absolutely, I think if investments can be made in those countries, it would absolutely help to address some of those concerns. So I think it's about um, again awareness building because I think that's a missing link, is what I'm trying to say. It's people don't always have the chance to view the bigger picture and be able to see the various layers and the cause effect relationships. And then in the case of migration, the push pull factors. You think of people who are trying to seek asylum or seek refuge in other places that end up dying on those journeys by boat or whatever it might be. And they're taking that huge risk for a reason again. So I think just unpacking some of those layers is what we tried to do at the Borgen Project. We also have a blog and an online magazine where we're sharing tons of articles on these key issue areas that again are affecting everyone, right? Everyone across the globe. So I think those are some really good resources. I do want to mention as well that in the work that we're doing um, at the Borgen Project, a part of that includes awareness around what is going well. And so we don't just only want to focus on, okay, yes, there are many, injustices and things that are going wrong, but we also want to be able to spread some hope about solutions that are taking place, and things that are accomplishing some good in the world. Many of the specific pieces of legislation that we've worked on over the years, and helped champion across the finish line, and the number of people that those have reached. We do try to be, I guess, a beacon of hope, if you will, in this fight, because it's easy as well to get bogged down by numbers that are trending in the wrong direction. One of the things we look at pretty closely is child marriage. And we saw many reports, especially at the beginning of COVID, where numerous countries were experiencing huge spikes in the rates of child marriage, with girls being most affected as expected. And during 2021, child marriage rates, or I think 2020 to 2021, child marriage rates actually doubled, which is just really scary to even think that was possible. Um, but, at the same time, we're able to think about, okay, well, what else has been accomplished to address that since that moment, during the beginning of the pandemic. So we look at, education programs, which were able to help get more girls in school over the past few years, and how that helped to prevent child marriage from worsening. And so I did just want to spotlight that we tried to make sure that we can have those examples of progress and really make it clear that it is possible to eradicate global poverty within our lifetimes, if these investments are made now.
Yeah. Well, so that's encouraging to hear that there is good stuff happening. There's progress being made. What are some of the more successful, I don't know, programs or interventions, or what has led to that success?
Yeah. Well, I think there have been more and more pieces of legislation that are being introduced. And I've mostly been just talking about US Congress specifically so far, since, that's been our main focus as an organization. And we're just still learning the landscape in other countries as well, as far as the UK and Canada. But in terms of US Congress specifically, we've seen so much success with specific bills within this space when it comes to global development, that have measurable outcomes, specifically. So just increased advocacy and awareness around these have made huge strides. One of those areas has been around global hunger. Again, just to spotlight that topic in particular, which is one that the Borgen Project has focused a lot on over the years, but even more so recently, because we've seen global hunger crises that are ongoing in multiple regions over the recent years, as I said. But one of the bills that we worked on is called the Global Food Security Act. The original bill passed in 2016, and we did a ton of advocacy around that. And what's really special about that bill is that it creates sustainable futures, because it's built off of the premise, or the saying that goes, give a man a fish, feed him for a day, teach a man to fish, feed him for a lifetime. So it is sharing sustainable agriculture techniques with smallholder farmers in developing countries, who can then be able to provide for their families, their communities. And that has had some really strong outcomes, lifting millions of people from poverty in developing countries, and importantly, saving the lives of millions of children as well, because especially those under the age of 5. So those first 1,000 days of a child's life are so critical. And so we're really proud of that bill. And since 2016, that program has been reauthorized twice. And so we're thrilled to see that continue. And there are other programs similar to that in other spaces where we are continuing to push. So we're really glad to be able to look at multiple issue areas and um, not only be focused on one area. So each year we typically select, 1 to 2 big program areas that we'll push a ton of effort behind. We'll still have some secondary ones as well. And then as each one moves forward, we're able to cycle in others that we can really get the advocacy behind and build the awareness around. So we're really blessed to be able to look at multiple issue areas as well.
Yeah, yeah. So, you mentioned agriculture. That's incredibly important because people have to eat. What are some other areas that this types of aid might address in lifting up some of these countries that struggle?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say education is vital, which I kind of touched on a little bit before. Um, but there is a bill that we're working on right now, which is focused on education as well. It's called READ, as in READ. And the original bill passed in 2017, and it helped 122 million learners in developing countries over the past several years access basic education. And that is probably one of the best tools to be able to help address global poverty. Like I mentioned, child marriage as one issue that education can help combat. Gender-based violence, which often there is some connectivity between child marriage and gender-based violence, but that's something that education can help solve as well. And so we are really hoping that Congress will pass this reauthorization for the READ Act for the US government's education programs to continue in developing countries and give people the opportunity to help themselves to have brighter futures.
Yeah, nice, nice. So, these types of programs we're talking about, who provides these services? I mean, as we get the U.S. government and other governments to offer more aid, does that go to countries to manage things? Does that go to nonprofit providers that do things, or more?
Yes. So USAID works with NGOs in country, as they call it, to be able to implement these programs. And so that helps to combat potential for corruption and things like that with the way dollars are spent. I will double check on the exact percentage that goes to partner organizations, but it is a very high percentage, and that helps to combat any threat of corruption if money were to be going government to government. The good thing in operating that way as well is that it helps to have that level of buy-in from the people who are going to benefit from that aid. And so they're working with actors who are on the ground in those countries and recipients or beneficiaries of those programs. And so it allows for more successful implementation because they can get, advice on, let's say, cultural differences in how a program might need to be implemented in a certain country compared to what US best practices might be. And so having that coordination, I think, has been really successful, especially in recent years. So I think I personally would love to be able to have more examples or visit more countries myself to see that work in action because There are many, many success stories. Some of our staff members at the Borgen Project also live in other countries, and so it's been really interesting to hear how they have seen USAID implemented on the ground as well. So we truly are global. As I'm thinking and talking more, sometimes I forget that we are very global in terms of not just the programs that we're building support for, but the staff, and we also have volunteers in other countries too who are bringing their perspective and showing us what's happening where they are as well. I think there are other factors that come to mind as well. Just thinking of my own background, looking at, and this is a whole other topic, but it just reminded me of, you know, IMF loans like Jamaica received, in years past, and just the impact of some of that funding that was received as well, which is, obviously actual loans. But there's a lot to unpack with some of these some of these avenues that we're looking at as well. So I think this could be a whole topic on its own.
But incredibly important because that has
Yeah.
often been the world's approach to helping poorer
Hmm.
countries is to give them loans and then they end up buried in debt, not serving their citizens because they're trying to pay
And
off interest and all these loans that they got. So the world needs to change its approach and not have so many
exactly.
loans and just give money
Hmm.
instead of lending money.
And yes, and I think what I think is important, as I mentioned before, is certainly in times of emergency, when aid is just needed, right? So if there's a hunger crisis, like people are starving, people are dying, like they need food. But it's that other piece, which is the development piece, which is okay, what's the long term? What's the next 5 years? What's the next 10 years? How can we build something, or how can people who are suffering right now build something for themselves? So, like with the sustainable agriculture, teaching these farming practices, teaching um, climate resistant practices, um, that can help future generations as well. And so, to be honest, that is something that has been more challenging to even discuss in the current moment that we are in, at least for the work that we're doing, because at the Borgen Project, because there's so many crises happening all at once. So that's actually been a little bit of a challenge because we did a lot of work around Ukraine, um, in the past 2 years now, almost. That's an emergency. That's a crisis conflict. As I mentioned, there's global hunger, hotspots popping up. During the beginning of COVID, we spent a lot of time around vaccine equity in 2021, and so um, it's been a challenge, is what I'm trying to say, in terms of actually also keeping that focus on the development piece and what tools are needed for future generations to stand on their own as well. And so we're hoping to get back to more of those conversations at the Borgen Project. We were glad to do some more work on that bill I mentioned, which is the Global Food Security Act reauthorization, which passed in 2022. So we were thrilled to be able to do that work and hope to do a lot more when it comes to development going forward.
So we were talking earlier about, basically the money that is available in wealthy countries to do this work. So we were earlier talking about the, growing wealth among billionaires, for instance. Listeners might want to check out a recent interview I did with Chuck Collins, who addresses inequality issues. And he laid out for us the massive wealth that is available if we would simply tax it and redirect those resources to more productive activities. So I think a lot of people, when they hear about this kind of work, they don't want their money being sent overseas to help those people when there's needs at home. But I think a middle class or, lower income person doesn't need to worry about more taxes to get this done. I mean, we have wealth available. Wealthy people have it. They could share it or be taxed to
And
get this done, you know?
sure. And I mean, even the potential tax rate would be small to those multi-billionaires and multi-millionaires. I think it's something like if there were a 5% tax for the world's richest, so multi-millionaires and multi-billionaires, it would eradicate poverty for 2 billion people, just like that. So definitely something we look at as well. So no, I'm glad you brought that up.
As you all do your meetings with politicians about
Mhm.
these issues, does that come up, this taxation element of like, hey, we could come up with the money if you tax properly? I mean, and how do they react?
Yeah, so we haven't. I know Oxfam has. I think in the past 2 to 3 years, they've run a number of campaigns on that. We haven't focused our effort on that as yet, or we just have not um, done any advocacy on that. But it's something that we have um, been able to highlight through some of our online resources for our supporters and advocates who are starting to think like the wheels are turning, especially young people, and they are the ones that are just doing incredible work. To see the way in which even high school students who are participating in some of this work, they are well read. They are ready to go and are prepared with talking points that are so impressive that it just makes this whole thing easier. But we personally have not focused on the taxation in our advocacy specifically.
Yeah, that's fine. One other piece of this, which makes it all feel attainable,
Mm.
is that there is, what's the terminology? For instance, the United States dollar is very strong. So if an American goes to take a vacation in a poorer country, they're sometimes amazed to be like, oh my God, I could buy this stuff so cheap. I just had the fanciest meal ever for $5. Like, the currency has a lot of buying power in poorer countries. So it seems that you can leverage that for good, right? You can buy a lot of agricultural equipment cheap. You
Yeah.
can buy other stuff cheap, so you can really make a big difference when you bring a strong currency to a poorer place and use it to stimulate the economy there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of, I was chuckling to myself just for a moment because, um, for instance, Jamaica, like I was able to visit a year ago, I think, and food prices, because they import so much of their food, it's actually a lot more expensive. So the dollar doesn't doesn't go as far sometimes there
Yeah,
because
yeah.
they're importing so much, which is a whole other story. Um, but otherwise, when we think of even poorer countries where it takes so little, and again, that just goes back to the whole, how much would it take to end certain um, certain injustices? Like it's not a huge amount of money, especially in the specific country dollars that it's being invested, but literal life changing for people who are right sleeping on a blanket, like that's their bed.
Well, some of this development aid, a lot of it is hiring people to do stuff,
Yeah.
right? So you can take a large amount of money, go to a poor country, and you could hire people to build infrastructure or to electrify the place
Mm.
or to like revamp agriculture, or you can pay people to do good stuff. And I'll just compare this with over the COVID-19 pandemic. We had all the shutdowns all over the world. We had economies grinding to a halt. And somehow governments around the world came up with well over $20 trillion to stimulate the economy. That included plenty of money to pay me and fellow Americans to stay home and do nothing, right? And so if you can do that, maybe you could come up with money to send to poorer places to hire people to do needed things, you know? You could really do a lot there.
Yeah. I think I hope we can see more effort within this space. I was going to say that it's been a very challenging year for groups like the Borgen Project because um, of everything that's going on in Congress. There's been a lot of delays, a lot of lack of anything happening.
Yeah.
And so that's been challenging to get our message in front of more lawmakers. So we're hoping that as things kind of go forward in this new year, that we can be able to reprioritize a lot of these efforts because a lot of um, the conversations that have um, taken precedence have been around things like, okay, actually keeping the government open, avoiding shutdowns, like that process has taken a lot longer in recent months. So that has also had a huge impact, unfortunately, on the piece that we care about. So we're hopeful that Congress can get themselves together so that we can get some more attention on this as well. And like I mentioned, we're excited to also be doing work in the UK as well, which um, it's interesting how similar the political landscape is over there as well. So that's been a little bit easier because we haven't had to learn it, from scratch, if you will. Although of course there's still differences, but um, we're hopeful to see some progress there too.
Something that I hope for in the coming years, and certainly, I'm working towards it, is that we could have international systems for addressing poverty. And part of this we talked about earlier, but another piece is just to have wealthier countries pitch in the money and have faith that it will actually solve the problems. So the US politicians might say, well, why are we going to be the only ones funding this stuff? Can't these other countries do it too? And if we had a system for the other countries doing it too, then US politicians would be more willing because they would see themselves as part of a larger effort where everyone is fairly pitching in to get these problems solved. And then, you're amassing more resources, which then gives us better faith that we're going to actually solve the problem, rather than the small drop in a bucket kind of thing.
Yeah, and I mean there is a UN target to accomplish just that, specifically for wealthier countries to um, strive toward, which is a mandate for 0.7% of the each wealthier country's gross national income. 0.7% of that should be spent on foreign aid. So there is a directive to accomplish that. That's been around for a while, but whether countries actually live up to that commitment each year is another story. And so, for instance, like in the UK, um, they cut their commitment level to 0.5% in recent years, um, citing focus on domestic policy issues. But then it's kind of a circular argument because, they're going to cut aid to certain programs, but then there's increases in migration from countries where they're cutting that aid. More people are, making dangerous journeys to try and find safety in UK. But had maybe some of those programs continued, would have prevented more migration from happening. So the mechanism exists in theory, but it's not always put into practice. Also thinking about the fact that even when the US is doing the 0.7% of GNI, the dollar amount of how much the US is investing falls far below many counterparts in Europe. And so that's also something to think about too, if there are other ways to maybe level the playing field and make it more equitable for rich countries that are contributing. Like not, there might be other potential good avenues aside from the GNI commitment, which, as we've seen, is not always effective. Canada as well, they haven't been meeting the commitment either. And so I think absolutely a broader conversation on a possibly more effective mechanism for having those outcomes. And again, recognizing how this is actually solvable. This shouldn't be. But it is, and since it is, what's going to be done? And I think, I hope that maybe in another 5 years we can be having a different conversation, showcasing much more progress has been accomplished. More people are able to do more than barely survive, and the world looks different in a good way. So I try to be optimistic because, as I said before, it's sometimes it's easy to get bogged down in, quite frankly, some of not just the statistics, but seeing the stories. A lot of the groups that we work with, we're able to hear real life stories from people who are living through the conditions or people who have survived, and so having those examples, it's really easy to, especially for those that are still suffering through, to feel down. But I think we try as much as we can. At least I do try to focus on, okay, what good is being accomplished, and that keeps us going. I think at the Borgen Project too is always having the back of our minds, okay, here's the good that's happened, and kind of take that message forward as well. That, when speaking to lawmakers as well, we find is really effective if we can show as many case studies as we can of effectiveness in foreign aid, when we can bring that information to them in a digestible format as well. So something that's really easy to see and understand, it makes a world of a difference. And so we try not to lose sight of those solutions that are doing amazing work.
Yeah. Well, that's really important because I think there's this perception many people have that poverty around the world cannot be solved. It's sort of like, well, in my whole lifetime, there's been desperately poor people out there and there's been people working on it, and here we haven't solved it yet, so it must be impossible. But I think what's been happening is over the last few decades, we've had professionals working on it and developing good solutions. And the best practices have advanced. And there's people out there who know how to make a good impact. They simply have not been funded enough. And so it's not like it's intractable because we don't know how to do it. It's that it just hasn't been done yet because we haven't funded it yet. We haven't, as a society, decided this is important and we're going to get it done, you know? So once we put the money there, I think, I mean, I'm not saying it's easy, right? This is hard work. It's complicated, but it's doable if we just put the money into it.
Absolutely. And um, just kind of going back to the idea that a lot has been accomplished. We need to get the more up to date statistics from maybe last year, but right prior to COVID, poverty had been halved within 2 decades. I mean, that is huge. Infant mortality rates have really improved in the most vulnerable places as well. And so there's so much to celebrate, like even though there's still a lot left to do, as I mentioned. But I think even just thinking about the fact that poverty halved in 2 decades is not something that people maybe know off the top of their head. And so again, going back to that, maybe reminding people like, hey, this is what was accomplished in just 2 decades with continuing to prioritize this, like we can, actually solve this. But I think one thing that's been interesting is how easy it was to kind of fall off track with that push of solving poverty. And that happened with, I think certainly with COVID in countries where we saw, they stopped committing to the UN target of that 0.7% of GNI, and how that's just kind of dragging on even, after kind of that pandemic level crisis has waned. It's almost like an excuse, like let's keep let's keep that low, so we don't have to spend. But then it's like, but we all do well, and like I just want to like get that info across clearly. Like we need PSAs like all day, like listen, we all do well, and we all do well. Benefits everyone.
Well, as a culture and as our political systems, we will need to learn how to walk and chew gum at the same time. We will always be having to focus on multiple threats at once. And if we get distracted by every new crisis that comes along, we're not going to make progress. And we just have to continue even when the world is a little tumultuous. Because that's just what it does.
That's what it's going to be. It's the world, the way of the world. Yeah.
Well, I've been enjoying this conversation and learning a lot about how to address poverty. Is there anything that we haven't covered yet that you think needs to be?
Yeah, I think one thing I did want to mention, though, as we've been talking, especially in the past few minutes, about just that it is possible, and getting that messaging in front of the right people. I do want to make note of the fact that in some of the programs that we've looked at over the years, how interestingly successful we have been at getting lawmakers to support a particular issue. And what we found is that if an elected official, so a member of Congress, hears from just 10 people who are their constituents, so 10 of their constituents are calling in about, let's go back to that global hunger bill, so the Global Food Security Act, or 10 of their constituents email about the Global Food Security Act in a week, they're more likely to support, either vote in favor of that bill or co-sponsor, which means lend their support to that bill. And they're also more likely willing to meet with me or, let's say, Clint regarding that bill and supporting it. So we found that just a few voices and key areas can help us to move the needle. So sometimes we also think we need like thousands of people to contact one member of Congress. And in some cases, it's just a few dozen people who are speaking up. They could be in a small town USA, and we're able to get support on a key issue and help save lives. So it's just interesting how each person is a wave. I like to think, and they can create that ripple effect with just a dozen friends and family members picking up the phone and saying like, "Hey, support this because one sentence, like, this is why it's important." And so it's surprising, I think, how we can make that change if more people were aware of that small fact. But we keep pushing, from our end to encourage and let people know that they can do this. I think that's what I'm trying to say is I think myself, even before I joined the Borgen Project, you don't realize how much access you can have as an individual to let your voice be heard. And that your elected official, whether you agree with their politics or not, their job is to listen to you. And they will if you speak up. Might not always win or get them to vote in favor of what you want, but they're going to listen. And so the more we can keep pushing them, the more chance we have to solve all of these crises and right these wrongs. And I'm really looking forward to the next couple of years doing this work personally.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that because, even me doing this advocacy work that I do, yeah. I can feel sometimes intimidated or hopeless about getting my government to behave well. And so you've given me a good reminder that instead of just sitting here feeling helpless, I should just take 5 minutes and pick up the phone. Yeah. Just make a phone call. 5 minutes. Yep. Like it's really nothing. And if I'm sitting around at dinner with a handful of friends, say, hey, everybody, let's all just make a phone call right now. And they'll hear from 5 or 6 people. And it's even better.
Yeah. We call that the swarm. Like we swarm, do a quick swarm with friends and family and just everyone call in at the same time. I will also say that we have on our website, which is borgenproject.org, we have an action center and it allows you to send an email to your elected official within less than a minute. So that's even quicker than picking up the phone and like being placed on hold like this, even though the phone call is also easy, but sending an email less than a minute. So, and the lawmakers actually review. That's the other thing too. Every call that's placed to an elected official goes on a call log. But that call log doesn't just disappear. The congressional staffers sit with the congressional leader, so the senator or representative, every week, and they go through, okay, we got 25 calls about, girls' education this week in developing countries. We got 10 calls on the Global Food Security Act, and they can list, which issue area they got the most calls on. And then they can start to prioritize, okay, like, all right, we actually have to start listening to global poverty topics because lots of calls are coming in. And again, lots of could just be Shelby has gotten 12 people to call, not even 12, you could get 6 people to call. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's a lot because average person is not picking up the phone. They don't even know it's possible.
Right. Yeah. Well, and even if I've been kind of busy and haven't had time to look into what particular bills are in play or know a particular piece of legislation, I could probably call or email and just say, hey, I care about poverty in Africa, for instance. Yeah. What are you doing? Like, ask, what are you doing? And, that makes them pay attention.
Yeah, absolutely. It can just be a, broader issue area that you want to spotlight. But I would encourage anyone listening to kind of take that agency and, be able to engage in that way because it's really powerful and literally within minutes you can make a difference. And, that sounds cliche, like, oh, I'm just one person. But we have seen that in action. We had one amazing volunteer, we've had many amazing volunteers, but one in particular who, for a year and a half, she called her congressman every day, called his office every day. They knew her voice, they knew her name. like, oh, hi. Let's call her Mary. Hi, Mary. And they knew what she was calling for. They're like, okay, calling again um, about wanting the congressman to support foreign aid. And like her congressman, who's no longer in Congress, but at the time he was very anti foreign aid. But in the end, she was able to not only get a meeting with him directly, but she was able to convince him to be more pro foreign aid. And he actually ended up introducing a bill that the Borgen Project endorsed and we advocated for maybe 5 years ago. So that was a really cool story. And how she convinced him was that she, in the small town that she lived in, she was able to find an example of a small business who was an outdoor sporting goods company. So they sold kayaks at a small business. And it so happened that a large part of their customer base were people in South Korea who were importing kayaks. So she was able to show that case study, like, okay, well, the US was investing years ago, giving foreign aid to people in South Korea, and now they're importing kayaks from our local small business, like, connect the dots. So, and that was one person, and we're going to take credit for him introducing the bill and like supporting, because she literally worked for a year and a half nonstop, and a few minutes per day contacting him over and over. So it is possible. Like, we've seen it in action, and it's like transformative. A single person, and he, like I said, went on to introduce the bill, and the bill passed, and the bill has literally made a huge impact the past 5 years. So
I like it. Very cool.
Yeah. I think that might be good to end. Good note.
Well, yeah, that's a wonderfully positive, ending point to just remind people that it's doable. We just got to do it. We can make it happen. So
yeah, very cool.
Well, Kim, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really cool conversation. I've enjoyed it, and I've learned some things. So thank you.
I'm glad to have been invited on, firstly, and I'm looking forward to keeping up with episodes to come. And I think it's really important work that you're doing and having this platform to have these conversations that people can connect with. And so hopefully someone was able to connect with our conversation today. And I'm looking forward to staying in touch as we see what the world will look like, going forward, but continuing to be hopeful. So thanks again, Shelby. Appreciate it.
Very cool. And thank you, listeners, for joining us. You should look at the show description or the show notes where we'll put a link to the Borgen Project. And I hope that you'll go and check out their website and all the magnificent things that they're doing. And you might also go to the Human Survival Project and look at our website and all that we're doing. And something awesome would be if you share this episode with a friend or a family member or a neighbor and just spread it around. Let's get the good ideas out there. All right, thanks everybody. Take care.